This module will deal with visual language, the way we see things, perceive them, and then the way we can manipulate them as we control the design aspect of visual design. We'll be talking about perceptives and elements and principles. Let's talk now specifically about some of these areas of visual communication and visual language. The perceptives are the ways we perceive the world around us. We're going to talk specifically about scanning and focal point and warehousing. Scanning is the process we use to visually place an image in our head. The number of passes the eyes takes to gather that information. That's easy to understand. Reading we do comprehend, but we may not know that we actually use the same reading technique when we look at an image. So try to be aware of the number of passes you might be taking as you scan this following image. The thing that makes this a little tricky is the fact that we scan an image much faster than we scan text. We don't read every single letter to make a word. We are reading words and sometimes group of words to get the impression of text. But in a visual image, we are scanning much more quickly. Were you aware if you made this scan? How about this scan? I'm guessing most of you recognize that one. Did any of you realize you made this scan, perhaps? So these were all possible scans. I hope you do notice that most of those scans were starting at the left, at least, for some part of the scan, so left to right, which is how we've been learning to scan pages for text purposes. How about this image? Are you aware of how many passes it took you to gather this information? I'm going to go back from that image. Were you aware of how many passes you may have taken? And let me ask you a few questions. How many people were in the picture? Where were we? Anything particular you remember? Take a moment here to stop and write down a few of those impressions, and then we'll go back to this picture. Hopefully you correctly mentioned 3 people, because I think there's one visible through a window if you look carefully. If you had taken time to try to read all the text, which is a scanning process, it would have taken much longer. But I think most of us perhaps gathered that we were at a barber shop because of the barber pole that we see. We collected the idea that we were in a town. We collected image, maybe some idea because it's black and white and because of the look of the people and because of the prices that we were probably not in a contemporary location. How about that image? Stop here and write down your impressions. Now, if you would spend a little more time scanning this, maybe you really didn't see a Native American holding a gun. That's actually a peace pipe if you look a little closer. And that certainly has a totally different meaning than a rifle might. All right. So we have now scanned and gathered information, and in our scanning process, we were probably stopped at moments to look at certain objects. So let's go back to this original image we looked at. Are you aware of any places that your eye tends to stop and look? How about right here? Or up here? Over here? Or right here? Some of the reasons might be because one gentleman's wearing white pants, so that value attracts, or the white apron on the other character, or the fact that he's wearing blue because he's the only cool color in the entire picture. So all of these are different focal points that make us stop and look and gather information. Strong focal point on one of the characters. And notice the diagonal line of the mountain, the horizontal line of the guns, many things that carry us immediately to the focal point and strengthen that focal point for us. So, that is focal point. Last, we have to somehow process the image, place it in our mind, categorize it within our head. So let's take some judgment calls and talk about warehousing. Let's go back to our original image, and I'm going to ask you some questions. Where do you think we are? I'm guessing most of you will not say we're in Provo, Utah. So where are we? Is this even the United States? Again, write down your impressions. You may suggest we're in Europe, and you might even have a specific location. When are we? I'm guessing that you probably don't think we're in a contemporary setting. If you said Renaissance, if you said 13 or 14 or 1500s, you're probably correct. But I think most of us recognize the fact that these people are not wearing the clothing that we would normally be wearing. And last, why are we? Why did the artist take time to actually paint this painting? What is the event? If you had noticed the name of the painting the very first time we showed it to you, it's called The Peasant Wedding. So we are at an event, a special event. If it's a wedding, there's got to be a bride there. So have you found the bride? I think most of you have identified her sitting at the back, towards the right there just a little bit, in front of that dark panel or cloth hanging on the wall with something floating over her head. But have you found the bridegroom? You might pan the room and see what you think about. Is it the elderly gentleman off to her left, our right, or the gentleman at the very end of the table who seems to be fairly well dressed? If you knew that in this period it was most typical for the groom to help serve the guests, maybe it's a little easier for you to find him. Had you noticed the character in the very far left bent over pouring drinks? Maybe this is more likely our bridegroom. Now that we have more warehouse information, it might change how we will categorize or label the information we're looking at. I'd like you to stop and jot down a few things you think about when, where, and why we are here. You may have written down some symbolism of Christ being crucified. Probably guessing that we're not, therefore, in a contemporary period. But let me point out the fact that if you did draw allusions to Christ, these people certainly are not clothed in the correct garments to be in Christ's period. But again, your warehousing may have confirmed the fact that often in the Renaissance, they painted Christ within the Renaissance to make him more accessible to the common man. Other elements of this visual, the red around Christ, the figure, might suggest blood. The white draped around Christ himself might signify innocence. And we might suggest there might look like there's imprints on his hands and his feet, though we can't see for sure what those are. And they're standing on a plank of wood that may suggest a cross. But all of these are only warehouse images to us and help us draw conclusions about what we're seeing in the painting. What do you think the conclusions are from what you're seeing here? A famous campaign. If Batman likes milk, and I like Batman, then I should like milk. Famous campaign using many things that we warehouse as things we like, and therefore should associate milk in that likableness. All right, we've covered the perceptives. You might want to stop here and jot a few notes down about the perceptives and how you would define each of those. Scanning, focal point, and warehousing. Now let's proceed with the elements. Line, form, value, texture, color. You may find other books that have a different list somewhat from this list of elements, but we're going to use these 5 for our discussion. First, let's start with line. Line is so important in our world that we actually have names for different types of lines. Here are vertical, horizontal, and diagonal. Now, I'd like you to think about the first line, vertical. Where would you go in your world to find vertical lines? I'm going to assume you'll talk about forests or cathedrals or prisons, okay? These are all environments in which we might consider man versus God or man versus an authority of some type. So we may contemplate when we're in a vertical environment, man and a superior authority. Where would you go in your world for horizontal? Jot down a few words. Maybe you said the prairie, the plains, the ocean. Maybe you said a bedroom or a boardroom. These areas denote man versus man. We don't think about standing at the ocean side, perhaps the same things we might think about as we stand in a cathedral, the redwood forest. We may be considering more or thinking more about man and who's across that ocean and that body of water. And then diagonal. Where do we go in our world for diagonal lines? Mountains, playgrounds. These areas might denote tension or energy or movement of some sort for us. So we're looking at perhaps a vertical line that's moving to be horizontal, or vice versa, a horizontal line that's moving to be vertical. Diagonal can add tension and energy. Where are we? What type of line are we looking at? And therefore, are we considering man versus authority or God? Where are we now? Horizontal. Are we thinking about man versus authority in this kind of situation, or are we thinking more about man in relationship to the world around him? And I'm guessing that when you're dealing with diagonal line, you're not at rest. You're talking about emotional or energy or tension, and you're probably not going to hang this in some room like a bedroom where you want to relax. Now, another part about line is that there are two distinct categories, formal and informal line. Here's formal line. Let's define it. It's symmetrical. Symmetrical does not mean the same. It means that it is matched in mirror image. Therefore, it's predictable. If I gave you half of it, you could tell me what the other side looks like. It would be the mirror image. Not the same, but flipped image. It's man-made. We don't tend to see formal line that's symmetrical in nature. And it is powerful, but it's in control. Someone created it and they're in control. Informal line has the opposite meanings. It's asymmetrical. It is still balanced, but it's not balanced symmetrically. It doesn't mirror image itself on either side. Therefore, it is unpredictable. If I gave you half of this image, you could not create the other half. You could guess at it, but you probably wouldn't get it right. It tends to therefore be more natural. Nature tends to be informal. And it is powerful, but it is out of control. I don't mean as a teenager or a young child. I mean it has control within itself. No one seems to be controlling it. So, comparison between formal and informal lines. Here's a painting. We're a very formal environment, and though it is somewhat informal in its presentation, it's not completely symmetrical, but certain elements are. The couple at the bar, for instance, are fairly symmetrical. So we are in a fairly formal lined environment, as opposed to this informal area in which we may be even representing formal lines as in buildings below, but they're not presented to you fairly formal. They're fairly loose. They're informal. That's line. You may want to stop now. Make a few comments to yourself about line and what that means to you and what you might look for if you wanted to capture images that suggest line. Form, the second element. Two things have to exist for form to exist, a field and a motif. Those are the formal names. We actually would say a background and then a shape in front of it. So the relationship of a shape to its background has to do with form. You see the word motif because it is a black object in front of a white background. Were I to change the shape to match the white, you no longer can see it. If I change the background, then you would see it again. So the form of motif is visible because of the contrast of the background. How about this? How many horses are there? Start counting, keep looking. There may be more than you think. They're a bit lost because they match their background, so it's hard to see the shapes or the motifs. And in this painting, the artist has suggested wet by using contrast of the objects to their background. The background is wet, light colored. The objects are dark and dry. So, form. Take a few notes. What would you look for if you were trying to find images that denoted form and the use of form? Let's discuss now value. There are two major values, black and white. White is the highest value, black is the lowest value, and then in between we have many different shades of gray. If you turned off the color on your television, you would be watching value. And interestingly enough, we place values, human values, on the values of black and white. Villains are black, heroes are white. But it's the grays in between that have us guessing more. Here's the use of black and white in one image. And Ansel Adams, who definitely had the ability to do color photography, but chose to shoot in black and white, so it was a study in values. So take a few notes on value, what that means to you, what pictures you might pick to denote value. The next element is texture. Of all the elements, it might be the one that we notice the least, but might affect us the most. And texture can either be tactile or it can be detail. Tactile means that we get a feeling that we know that if we touched it, there would be a different texture to it. Detail doesn't necessarily mean we would touch it and feel it, but there's enough detail or fine elements within an object that give it a texture, give it attention, focal point. For example, here's a costume. There isn't a lot of detail or texture to this. This might denote an angel, but if we add color to it, suddenly the detail or the texture changes, and now we might have a different impression. And if we added even more detail, we might suggest, oh, hey, maybe we're in the 1970s. Artists often denote texture in the way they paint objects. We all know what a lemon feels like, or an apple, and we also know what metallic feels like. The artist has rendered each of these by using a medium of oil paint to denote porcelain plates and shiny reflective metal objects over on the left, and the texture of what this fruit could be. I'm going to give you two different pictures from two different artists of the same location. What changes in these is the texture. So get a feel for this one. And now look at this one. Let's go back. What's changed here? Look where the detail is. It's in the environment, in the water, in the trees. The people lack detail. But in this one, the detail tends to be in the people. The background somewhat pulls back. And we get a different impression because of the choice of the texture and the detail. So, that's texture. Stop and make a few notes. What kind of pictures would you or images would you collect to denote texture? Next is color. Of all the elements, it's probably the most noticed by the viewer. And there are three controllable qualities of color: hue, value, and saturation. If you change one of them, you'll change color. Hue is often the color name. These are the three primary colors. So we're looking at red and yellow and blue. Each of those is a different hue. These are the secondary colors. And those colors will just keep multiplying. We get into the tertiary colors. How many colors are there? Millions of colors. We all know that. Now, what's in the center of the color wheel? This steps us into another dimension of what color is about, as we're talking about color. Because actually, if we turn this sideways, we would find out that a color wheel is actually a cut open orange. And we're looking at the center core of this sphere, because a color sphere is actually what color exists in. And if we add two more, white at the top and black at the bottom, we are looking at the full sphere of color. As we go from black to white, we are going into values. We've already talked a little bit about that. The highest value is white, the lowest value is black. And we can mix those with our colors. So if I took my one color here that's kind of a peacock blue and started mixing white into it, it would slowly lighten until it became a full white. The addition of white we refer to as tint. If, in contrast, I mixed it with black and pulled it down in the sphere, it would slowly get darker and move into what we call shades. So, if I know that black and white are also on opposite sides of the color sphere, if I went between those two, I would mix to gray. So we know that gray is the color that's at the center of the color sphere. I could also get to those, that gray color, by mixing two complements. Notice how it's spelled, P-L-E-M-E-N-T. That means opposite on the color wheel. If I were to mix these two complements in between, I would wind up with a gray. When we mix two colors, it pulls them into the center of the color wheel or the sphere and becomes less saturated. We call that tone. We've toned down the colors by mixing them into each other. Here is a great image to show the use of complements. Note how red the garment on this character and the one next to him is, mainly because of all the green that's around them. By placing the complement around this color, it helps make the color more red. Optical illusion. That's color. Those are the elements: line, form, value, texture, color. Make a few notes on color, and then make a few notes on the elements, so that you understand each of those 5 elements, and you could help pull those into images that you'll collect. Next, let's discuss the principles: balance, rhythm, and space. First, balance. If I create an imbalance visually, I can actively make the audience become involved in the image. If I were to leave this image on the screen for a length of time, it would probably bother you. You might start tending to lean towards your right as you're trying to help balance out this image. But let's solve the problem. Are you more comfortable? I'm guessing not. Getting more so? A little more so? Well, let's just solve it. We'll get out of there. We already talked about symmetry, and that if we have an image that is symmetrical, balanced in mirror image, it's obviously balanced formally by symmetry. But we can also balance an image asymmetrically or informally. You already know what those mean. Let's look at this image and decide how it's being done. You might stop for just a moment and write down what you think. How is this picture balancing itself asymmetrically? Let's discuss now some of the things maybe you've written down. If we look on the right, we'll see that there are deeper colors, deeper values. On the left, lighter values, more whites, more yellow, golds in bigger blocks of color. So this is asymmetrically balanced in value. It is also asymmetrically balanced in mass, you might say, because look on the right and the number of people there are, and then on the left and the lack of people. We might also, if we look more carefully, notice that there is more action this section on the left. There's movement, there's music, there's dancing. And on the right, there may be some sound, but it's probably people talking. It's definitely not a lot of action. And last, you maybe didn't notice, there's a lot more female characters on the left-hand side, and a few less on the right-hand side, and more masculine over there. So, this painting has indeed balanced itself, but asymmetrically, informally. You may want to now write down a few things about balance that would help you in picking out some images that have strong balance. The next principle is rhythm. Here is a rhythm, a pattern set for you. I'm guessing that some of you may think the pattern looks incomplete. If I were to add one more element to the entire rhythm, you would probably feel this rhythm is a little more complete. However, the rhythm was totally complete and in twos, well balanced, but probably more complete to you if we have the last rhythm element that sandwiches and closes off the rhythm. Now, if I change one of those, we learn what accented repetition means. By use of rhythm, I am focal pointing one object by making it different. Because there is a regular rhythm set in everything else, it calls attention to the one that is different. It doesn't matter where I place it within the rhythm, it will still be accented. Here's an image that uses rhythm, probably telling you it doesn't matter what color you buy, you just need to buy one. This image is full of rhythm. Write a few things down. What do you see as rhythm? How about the stanchions under the bridge? How about the people on the bridge? How about the grain in the distance or in the foreground? How about the mountains in the distance, and then the one in the middle, and then the curve of the bridge in the front? So in the different fields as we move forward, we find curves, rounded rhythms. Here's a repetition. Look at the windows on this train, and set off by the white panes or bars, in between them, and the rhythm of the paintings above, and the number of people in the windows. And you'll notice there is an accented repetition because suddenly in the middle there are two people, and they happen to be children, not adults, as we're seeing in the rest of them. Rhythm. Make a few notes. How would you denote rhythm in images? Finally, let's look at space. The placement of objects within an environment refers to space. So here are chairs. We would say that they become the positive space of this image. The area all around them is the negative space. The two work together, and both can be equally as powerful. Here's an object. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and I'm going to move it. Close your eyes. You may open your eyes. I've moved it to another location within the space. Close your eyes, I'm going to move it again. Okay, look, open your eyes. I moved it again. I'm going to move it one last time. Close your eyes. You may open them. Ah, didn't move it where you thought I might move it. Looking at this space, try to ignore the object within it. Pretty hard to do. Your eyes will keep going back up to that object. Let me move it to the bottom. Now, try to look at the space without looking at the object. A little easier to do. Your eye isn't drawn to it as much. We call anything at the top left is sitting in most inherent motion. This is the area of the page that we enter when we are reading, and therefore it pulls focus quickly. And we want to physically move it down to the place of least inherent motion. Here's a picture of a king and a queen in prison with a guard at the top of the stairs. Can the king and queen get out of the prison? The way it's set up, probably not. because the guard has more inherent motion than the king and queen. If, however, we change positioning, the king and queen could get out much easier because they have more inherent motion than the object up on the right. Here's a fairly well-known painting. Please note the inherent motion given to this wave as it's about to crash onto these ships of people. We fear for these people because of the power of the inherent motion of this wave. If we changed that, we would note that the power of the wave is still fairly strong, but because it doesn't have as much inherent motion, so now the boats can probably, they're going to be moved by it, absolutely, but they're probably going to crash through and everyone will be fine. That is space. We've talked now about the perceptives, the elements, and the principles. Take a few notes. Write a few things down. Think about how you would describe each of these terms to someone and how you would find images to help pull out the perceptives and the elements and the principles one by one so you could represent each of them.